Julie, welcome to South Florida Poetry Journal's interview of you about your book, Fugue and Aural History. And I'm so pleased to have been the person to read this book and to ask you these questions. I just immersed myself in it for a while and I so enjoyed it. And as I went back through to come up with more questions, I re-enjoyed it again. So I'm delighted to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I wonder if you would start us out by just reading the first part of your book, part one, and give us a flavor for what we're going to be talking about.
I will do it. So this is Fugue and Aural History. It's arranged in 3 parts, and this is the first segment of part 1. I was born on a sound. It was mostly quiet there. Sometimes a foghorn blared in the white smear, and we startled. The light was much more dangerous than the dark. This is often the case. Ferry boats passed in the harbor, resisting collision, arrived at the docks, safe and sound. The front of those boats is also the back. They never turn around. Our water was soft, salty, and cold, recessed from an ocean we couldn't see. Overflow seating. All day we watched a sound from our windows, from a hill overlooking the sound. My parents still live there. I only visit in dreams. I liked the idea that a sound could be seen. It tickled me. My own senses were always conjoined. Naturally, you could watch an aural event, listen to a visual occasion. The sound rippled, and we watched it. Sounds, sounds rippled, and we listened. The splash of my father skipping stones in the sound. The echoes of my father in me. Why is it called that anyway, I asked. A stone? No, a sound. Because sailors were so happy to reach safe passage, they called the inlet sound.
Thank you. Thank you. That passage to me really starts off the reader expecting more of the same, giving statements that are very, I don't want to call them plain, but simple statements about what's happening, that the more you read them, the deeper it goes and the more things get pulled in and everything is so nuanced, and it signals to the reader that the speaker has this deep feel for language and that we need to pay attention to language and see what our own deep feelings are about the language being used. So it's just beautiful. And
thank you.
You're welcome. The book is all about sound, as it said, but it's also about silence, I think. And one of the threads that leads us through the book is the idea of listening or hearing, and hearing that might be impeded. Can you tell us a little bit more about that theme and how that came about for you?
Well, this whole book, I think, qualifies as a happy accident. I didn't really know I was writing a book, and it turns out, because it's I don't know if you could see it right in the camera, but it's a smaller book. But really, it's also a very long essay of about 10,000 words that doesn't fit easily into most literary journal publications, but in and of itself feels rather complete. Like it doesn't feel to me like it wants to be 60,000 words or 50,000 words, but it happened because of the pandemic, as many things did. During the pandemic, I was thinking a lot about the quiet, noticing the quiet, or maybe noticing also how, because there was less traffic and because there were fewer sounds of just usually outside my window, I hear my neighbors talking to each other. I hear, more interaction happening. And there was so much less that, in a way, that's the balance of sound and silence, right? You also notice in the quieter times, every sound that you do hear feels much more amplified. And so I ended up writing this project, and I'm still envisioning it as part of something larger, though it won't look like this, because I needed something to do to help me cope with change and that isolation. And so I was reading the lectures and writings of John Cage, who is an experimental composer and innovator who I just feel tremendous kinship with. He passed away in 1992, so I did not overlap with him too long in this world and never knew him, but I began to study him in grad school around 2003. And then I was so fascinated by his commitments to sound and silence, and also, how he didn't just want to play the piano, he wanted to alter the piano. And even though his probably most famous work is 433, where the composer or the pianist comes in and sits at the piano for 4 minutes and 33 seconds and doesn't play, that in itself is fascinating to me, that people often talk about that as a performance of silence, but really, of course, it could never be silent. An auditorium full of people is never truly silent. And so when the pianist is sitting for 4 minutes and 33 seconds not playing, imagine, and then the tension around the expectation that they should be playing, imagine, I would love to witness that in person. Like, what would people do? You'd hear the nervous coughing, the creaking of the chairs, maybe someone gets up and walks out, all the ways people are trying to be quiet in case something happens, or they don't want to call attention, but just the fact of being in that space, even communal breathing alone, it's never going to be silent. So I think that as I am working on a much larger project using John Cage as the touchstone, this project happened because I put a little file on my computer called Sounds. And I was just trying to type into it every day about sound and about silence. And I thought I would just be chronicling the present, like the 2020 present. But it turned out I ended up immediately having memories of other sounds and growing up on a sound, Puget Sound. And suddenly I was writing a thing that I thought was actually the notes for my larger thing. But later, just by luck, I reread what was in the sound folder, and it was around 10,000 words. And I thought, I think this might be a lyric essay, like this might be its own thing. And it was already there, but I hadn't imagined it as it was. So that's essentially the arc of the story.
The randomization and the willingness to experiment with form is one of the things that marks this book, of course, and the idea of sound and silence. That's continued again on page 7, when you start to tell about your father complaining about water in his ears. And if you would just read that portion through the end of page 8 and include the list of words that you have there at the end of that piece, that would be great.
My father always complained of water in his ears. In the summer, often an infection called swimmer's ear. He took to wearing plugs in the ocean and the pool. Sometimes, so as not to forget to put them in, he wore the plugs for hours. My mother or I would be calling to him, waving and clamoring, but he couldn't hear us at all. I assumed he moved through the world in blissful silence during those times, perhaps a silence he preferred. But then when I was grown and my own ear canal was blocked with wax, I discovered a symphony inside my body, everything amplified, a swallow, a rumble, the iambic rhythms of my own heart. The world sounded the way it did underwater, surfacing slowly after a dive. And I knew then John Cage was right. How had I ever doubted? There is no true silence, only the absence of certain sounds, or the palimpsest of one set of sounds written upon another. Looksee, marmalade, nonce, oasis, pandemonium, quill, rapscallion, synesthesia, tacit, umbra, verisimilitude, wince.
Thank you. The word synesthesia was in that passage, and that is a key word, I think, in approaching this text that you've created. Language has this special power for the speaker. It has not only sound, but it also has color, and it has fire. And that kind of immersion in language and in all of its intensity is beautiful. page 23 and 24, just the top of 24, you have sort of some remarks or meditation on language that if you would read that for us, I think it would explain what I'm trying to say much better than I said it.
I will do it. Harold Meso once wrote, "I wish my hand might touch the fire between the letters of the alphabet. I have touched that fire. It is actual and metaphorical, for the synesthete always both at once perceive together. That fire is the torch I carry, the spark of light attending every sound. It's the heart, right? It's the heat rising off the printed page like the blue flame on our old gas stove. Once, while reading a paper and cooking at the same time, the words caught fire. And as I watched them burn, it seemed, how to say this, familiar. It was the most vivid experience of deja vu. But for me, every deja vu is also deja entendu. That is, if I have already seen it, I have already heard it too. The fire on the page, the words on the page, all crackling, onomata poetically.
Thank you. I wonder if other people in your childhood and as you were growing up noticed your special way that you apprehend language and how you see all the parts of language, or was that kind of invisible to people around you?
I think anybody's ever asked me that. That is a really lovely question. I think people knew, well, from the time I was really small, in school, a lot of early, like preschool, kindergarten was focused on, we had drawing time, we had visual art time and craft time. And I remember that I would always ask the teacher, is it okay to write during this time? Because for me, I don't have any skills at all as any kind of visual artist or crafts person, but also for me, it was like the complete package was in the words, because if I was writing, I felt like I was engaging all my senses. I felt like I was doing, art. So when they set up time for art, I remember that I always asked for that option. Like other kids were making the snowflakes, for the winter display. And like, could I write a poem about winter or a poem in the shape of a snowflake? And some teachers let me do that. And other teachers, were very strict and said, no, this time has been set aside for this. And we do that in language arts class, or we do that in English class. But so I would say, and at home, I was an only child, but my mother was a reading specialist. So words in the sense of literacy, right? In the sense of being a capable reader, not necessarily the fire part of language, but the efficient part of language. I think my mother really believed, and she was right in many ways, that just the ability to read and have that fluency would be crucial to certain kinds of success in life, particularly academic success. So I was reading really, really young because I was getting that very hands-on training at home. And I can remember it clicking very early, like that both of my parents would read me from picture books, but I sort of didn't need the pictures. Like the words were giving me a lot on their own. And I can remember that at a certain point, I was just reading with them. Like I knew what all the words were saying. And it wasn't just that I had memorized the book, but I could actually see the words. But they were very animate. They were, colorful. And sometimes they had, a whiff of a scent, or they had a sense of a taste. And so it just felt so alive. Like I didn't need anything else. I didn't even need the pictures. I was good. And I didn't ever tell anybody that officially, because I just thought that everybody felt that way. That everybody was sort of, chewing a word, or, smelling a word, or, certainly that everyone's letters were in color. And it never occurred to me that wasn't true, even though I thought maybe some people didn't love it the way I loved it. But, when people used to say in school, like, well, maybe my color yellow isn't the same as your color yellow, and we're both using the same word, that always made sense to me that, oh, people might see, a different color, but of course they see a color. And the synesthesia factor, I'd never heard of synesthesia, but when I was in college, in a very salient moment, my roommate and I would go to the gym and we would row on those rowing machines together. And she was a biology major, and she was really interested in the scientific side of things, but she was also very good, even though she doubted herself as a writer, she was very good at explaining very highly scientific concepts in very accessible terms. And I thought, wow, you would make such a good teacher. You're so good at helping me access things that were hard in science. And so one day we were just rowing together, my freshman year of college, and we were calling out the numbers of the rows. And I remember saying, it was very clear that it was the number 37. And I said, what color is your 37? Just making conversation with her. And she's like, what do you mean? And I was like, well, is yours yellow? And then she was like, well, I don't see anything. And I said, well, what do you mean? Like when you hear 37 or you say 37, don't you get like a flame of color that pops up and you see it? And she said, no. And I was like, well, don't you see that little ladder where all the numbers are and you can walk up or you can walk down? And she's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So then she decided to kind of investigate this, and she got into all of her science books, and she came back later and said, I think that you have synesthesia, and this is a phenomenon that people have studied. And so she started bringing me all this information, and I started reading about it for the first time. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. But I didn't know that identifying as a writer growing up, like I thought, oh, I just like to do this, but everybody's engaged with language the way that I am, but not everybody wants to write their own. And after that conversation with Becky, a lot of things started to open up, and I thought, oh, wow, I can actually write even about this, which was amazing.
That is fascinating. It really is. And I know somewhere in this book you mentioned that poetry is the only music that you need, that, everything is in the words. And
it really is. And I love when I can hear someone read in their words. It can be live, it can be recorded, it doesn't matter. But that's for me also very much equivalent to listening, when people put on, a symphony recording, or, it doesn't, I enjoy all music, but I don't need it. Like the human voice is also enough.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. One of the things I felt I was doing while I was reading this book was kind of collecting language, because some of the things that you create are such gems that it's hard not to think they're going to stay with you for a long time. The section about your AP teacher that includes the phrase reversible raincoat on page 18 was one of those places where I felt like I am never going to hear the word reversible or raincoat again without thinking about this passage and what happens in it. So it's about a page and a half or a little more long. But if you could read that to us, I want everyone else to have that same association in the future.
I will do it. Our AP teacher was a young woman from Georgia who had earned a master's degree at Emory. This phrase sounded so romantic to me. She wore men's white Oxford shirts, swiveled a fat diamond on her thin finger, reversible raincoat. Ms. K was married but kept her maiden name. Reversible raincoat. She didn't wear dresses, but did wear tall shoes like women usually wore with dresses. Reversible raincoat. I heard the South in Ms. K's voice and assumed she had chosen this book because it reminded her of home. Late in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, Singer kills himself after he learns that Antonopoulos has died. I raised my hand in class. This is a tragedy, like Romeo and Juliet, I declared. The first work of literature we were assigned our freshman year. Singer couldn't bear to live without his beloved any more than Romeo could. Was it the same girl, or a different girl, or a chorus of voices that replied, stop making everything weird. Weird as synonym, as euphemism for queer. There was laughter in the room, though nervous. No one belly laughed, but some girls tittered through their teeth. Mick described an outer room where we live for other people, the place where we are viewed but seldom seen. She also described an inner room where few are granted access, where we sometimes hide even from ourselves. Once in the high school hallway, I burst into tears, not like a balloon with its finite burst, more like a pipe that kept trickling after. I heaved and sobbed with abandon. Ms. K was powerless to comfort me. There was such kind concern in her eyes as she touched my shoulder, asking, what is it? What is it? It was not like me to break down, to reveal vulnerability in such a visceral way. The inner room had flooded, and the outer room began to fill with standing water. I earned an A in her class, red and delectable as the fruit with which it is often paired, A as in apple. But I could never look Miss K in the eyes again. I was A, as in ashamed. She had seen my true colors shining through, just like the song said, and the glimpse must have been terrifying. Perhaps because Miss K did not want to embarrass me further, she never wrote her words down. Instead, shortly before graduation, as I was stuffing my bag, rushing to leave, she spoke quietly and sincerely from across the room. In college, you will be free, and I hope you will feel empowered to explore the homoerotic subtexts in a great deal of American literature.
So wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. There's also a wonderful scene that is on page 21, where you have an encounter with your physical education instructor during the middle of the course. And it's just a small passage there, followed by another of the transition lists. And I wondered if you would read that, starting with "in college."
Oh, yes, Dr. Hacker. I recently saw her on the news during the Olympics. She's one of the coaches for the women's soccer team. And it was just incredible to see her all those years later. And she looked exactly like herself and seemed exactly like herself, but it was just a blast from that past. So strong. In college, I had to choose a physical education course. As I considered the offerings paired with the professors' names, only one combination compelled: self-defense, Hacker. Once Dr. Hacker asked me to lift her onto my back using a technique we had learned in class. I carried her that way around the gymnasium, our arms linked, her back pressing into my back, her sneakered feet in the air. Later, I learned she was a lesbian. Later still, I learned that I was. Tenacious, undulate, vellum, whimsy, xenia, yearn, zealot, alibi, birth, cunning, doggerel, ecstatic, fennel, gravitas.
Thank you. Thank you. I always imagine that people who are straight don't have to figure out their sexuality and discover it the way that we do. And so reading things like that bring that thought back to me. And I think our having to discover who we are in such a sometimes circuitous way leads us to be people who like to break other barriers. And this book really breaks a lot of barriers in terms of not only subject matter, but also form. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. This is a memoir, as it's termed, but it's also a love story. It's a story of how you became a teacher. It's a meditation. It's so many different things. And it also embodies the two definitions of fugue, which are, not only the musical passage, but also the idea of the vagueness of your mind is in a fugue. And so there are places like that where that comes true in the book. In an interview with Linnea Harris in Colorado State University's blog, you said that you felt genre liberated. And I wondered if you could talk more about how you consider yourself to be beyond needing to follow the strictures of genre, and how that is akin to the randomization that you used in organizing this book.
Well, thank you for all of your attention to the multivalence of the title and to these other interviews. That was a really lovely conversation with Linnea, and I remember the conversation, but I forgot that I said genre liberated, and I'm going to grab onto that and remember it because I do mean it, and it's a helpful phrase for me to give to my students. Mm-hmm. I teach hybrid forms now, luckily, happily, something that there wasn't initially a space for in our curriculum at FIU. And maybe, it's a space that's still opening in a lot of different programs. So the thing that comes up a lot in hybrid forms when you're teaching a class that is very genre liberated is, well, how do we identify something as hybrid or maybe outside of traditional genre? Or, we have lots of things we might call it, like unclassifiable, or just different ways of talking about work that doesn't align with our expectations for one certain genre. And the thing that always comes up, the paradox that always emerges, is that we have to have some kind of knowledge and awareness of traditional genre, or our sense of how different genres work and mean, if we want to start mixing, merging, blending them. And so it's the paradox of, sometimes the student will come to the class and say, I need to get away from all the pressures of the other genres. But in fact, those are still with us. It's just that it's sort of like, we're all working on our analogies for this all the time. But for me, one of the analogies I think about a lot is swimming, and how if you go to like a public pool or a community pool, and I was a swimmer for years and years, and I would always do that. You get in the lane, and it's not necessarily that it's designated by stroke, but if you see that everybody in this lane is doing freestyle and everybody in this lane is doing butterfly, those sort of have a different pace. So you probably get in the lane with the people who are swimming the stroke that you want to swim. And there's a very clear, you go up this side, you do your flip turn or your touch turn, you go back this side, and it has those very convenient sides to the lane that sort of demarcate. It's not as if everyone's butterfly looks the same, or everyone's freestyle or breaststroke or backstroke, but it's just that they're recognizably all doing their version of the same stroke in those lanes. And so the more practice you get working in those lanes, and I was really lucky that I had a very comprehensive multi-genre education, where even though I've never identified strongly as a fiction writer since I've been an adult, I took fiction workshops and was welcomed into them and learned a lot and did that cross training in those strokes. And then I always was drawn most to poetry, and then poetry gave way to creative nonfiction, which I loved. But it was like doing that work in those lanes, and then ultimately realizing, like, there's that moment, especially if a big public pool, has certain lanes designated for lap swim, and then there's often that other area that's not designated, that's just for open swim. For me, that's like the perfect metaphor for when you realize, like, okay, I've done my laps, I've done my strokes, I've warmed up my muscles, I've practiced the skills that go with each of them. And even if you're just trying to get out of the pool, you're not even trying to go over and have, kind of, do bobs or socialize with people, or, use a kickboard or whatever you might do over here, you often have to go out that way to get to the little steps that you climb up, because you don't want to intrude on the people who are still doing the laps. And it's when you're in that like free swim or open swim area that I always think, like, oh, you can do anything. But it's not as if all the work you did in the lap swim isn't informing what you do in the big open where there are no lanes. And even trying to get out of the pool, right? Like, you had to kind of pass through that space, and it's there, it's inviting you. So I'm always in a kind of, my genre liberation comes from my really good fortune to have spent years. I tell my students this, and some of them gasp in horror, but I went to college for 13 years, 4 years for undergrad and 9 years for 3 different grad programs. And I got to study all of the strokes in a way, and all the ways different people embodied the strokes differently. But it was then that I was like, now I can go in the free space of the pool and feel like this is what I want to take from poetry, which I always want to keep in the prose, even when the prose looks very much like prose. I want to keep the fire of the poetry, the attention to the individual words, the multivalence of the language. But then I can do narrative stuff, everything I've ever learned from fiction writers about how they build tension, how they, show character development over time. Even though my work is primarily autobiographical, I'm still drawing so much from how fictional characters are depicted, how sort of the guiding posts of fiction that I've studied. And then, of course, creative nonfiction itself is vast. But for me, being genre liberated, I get to go back and do lap swims anytime I want. And sometimes I really want that. Like, I really want the security of, now I am working in this recognized genre space, and I might still expand it in some way. Or, so many people give you invitations and permissions of how to do that stroke. But then when I get into the free swim area, I feel like I can draw on everything. And sort of, I imagine it as like, the mashup, the riff, the remaking of a lot of different sources of inspiration. And so I try to bring that actually into my hybrid classes. And we talk a lot about how the lyric essay sometimes gets flown as the banner over creative nonfiction, but it also is maybe the most clearly named and recognized hybrid form. So one of my current grad students, Travis Cohen, once said something very smart in class about how as certain hybrid forms get named and people start talking about them a lot, using those names and recognizing models of the hybridists who are writing them, he was sort of like, is that making another lane in the swimming pool? Maybe it is. So as we get more comfortable with the free swim, and then we start doing certain kinds of movements in hybridity, then maybe we are adding lanes, and it doesn't necessarily mean the work isn't hybrid, but it just means it's less of an unknown in that sense. So, but then I also can imagine like we can have additional pools where we can go to places that work we haven't yet imagined for ourselves, or that we haven't yet seen someone else create. Yeah. So it's really exciting. I do feel genre liberated, but also lucky to know and to have great models of all the genres.
Absolutely. One of the marks of genius I always tell students is that you learn how to do everything according to the rules, and then you figure out when to break the rules for creative purpose. Love that. And that's kind of what you're talking about, in a way of learning those forms and then mixing and choosing from them each thing. And this book is very much a poetry, it's memoir, it's all the different forms mixed together, and it's delightful. One of the threads that runs through it is the idea of, as we talked about in the beginning, being able to hear sound and listening, but also having things that impede your listening. And our Southern Florida writer, Edwidge Danticat, said it's very hard to learn when to begin a story, and you began with sound, which was the perfect place to begin. And then you end the book. I think it's equally hard to figure out how to end. You end the book with a scene at the ENT office that starts on page 43. And it's kind of about 3 pages, but if you wouldn't mind reading something, a longer passage, I think this ending brings together so many of the threads that you were weaving during this, and I'd love to hear it.
I'm so excited to read this because for those based in South Florida, I just can't recommend this doctor enough. Not only is he wonderful at what he does, but he's a really inspiring person. Dr. Morse, I believe now I'm thinking, is his first name Samuel or Daniel? They both sound the same in my head, but there's definitely a strong red quality to his first name. The ENT, or more precisely, the otolaryngologist, is Dr. Morse. What would his code name be? I chuckle to myself. He practices close to where I live and has hundreds of web stars attached to his name, but his picture is what seals the deal. He resembles John Cage in vibrant old age. Outside the hospital, a summer rain shower. I slip in the parking lot, the soles of my Toms not scuffed enough for good traction. Months now of sheltering in place, of not wearing shoes. I follow the green arrows to a distant wing. I see no one the whole way there. My pink mask has llamas on it and covers my nose, mouth, cheeks, and chin with many folds of presumed extra protection. One ear hears everything. The other is so deeply plugged, I am perpetually off balance. My head aches and my stomach flips. My heart thuds, unrelenting in my temples. Pow. Pow. So it seems you have some rather intractable wax, Dr. Morse begins as he enters the room. Even behind his mask, I can tell he is smiling. I nod. Well, the good news is I have a machine to take care of that. As Dr. Morse inspects my ears, I realize I never thought much about my ears until I had trouble hearing. I'm sure this is a story he has heard before. There's a composer I like. Well, he didn't necessarily appreciate that word, but he made music anyway, and he always referred to the ears as labyrinths. Does that seem fitting to you? Dr. Morse puts down the otoscope and begins a soothing lavage. For this, I sit upright, and he squirts warm water into my ears with something resembling a soap dispenser. No craning my neck or leaning to the side over a bucket. When he finishes, he says, well, the ears are amazing. To my delight, he mimes striking a drum and cymbals, adding the symbolic sound effects. Is it fair for me to ask of ears, nose, and throat, which one is your favorite? Dr. Morse readies the machine. First, let me ask you something. What do you do for a living? I'm a professor, I say. I teach writing. What kind of writing? Poetry, memoir, lyric essay, and then to clarify, creative writing, sometimes hybrid forms. Well, is one of those your favorite? I'm smiling now too, and I wonder if he can tell from my eyes or from the sound of my lips splitting apart. I guess I would say my favorite is whichever genre I'm teaching that day. Dr. Morse inserts a tube into my troubled ear. In a matter of seconds, he has finished suctioning, and I feel a cool rush of air, a sonic lucidity. Right now, he tells me, the ears are my favorite. The doctor's voice has become musical, every syllable sharp and clear. Already my head is lightening, my muscles loosening. That's it. Bada bing, bada boom. He stands in the safe distance doorway and waves his gloved hand. That's it. Hectic, interlude, jargon, keen, loofah, mimeograph, nincompoop, octagon, pom-pom, quorum, rescind, swimmingly, taut.
Thank you so much, Julie. This has been a wonderful conversation, and we should show the cover of the book again. I'm just gonna enjoy rereading this at times when I need to see that kind of masterful weaving together of so many different things, and it's a wonderful book.
Thank you so much. I love seeing your copy with all your post-it
Oh,
notes. If I see that many post-it notes, I just feel I'm in good hands. Thank you for giving the book so much care.
you're welcome.